Hello, my name is Corey and I would like to welcome you back to the Glader house. Last week I jumped into my sitting room makeover by building and installing the cabinetry, and I addressed my plan for the air return that sits behind these cabinets. And in today's video, I am very excited to jump back into this project and finish the face frames, build and install the cabinet doors, and finish off our toe kick with our air register detail. Starting with our face frames, I bought 17 8-foot 1x2 poplar boards. And I bought so many of them because I'm using them for both the face frames and the doors that will go on these. After double checking my cabinet measurements for accuracy and mapping everything out, I could start trimming the boards down using my miter saw. And then just like I did with the cabinet boxes, I used my pocket hole jig to drill pocket holes anywhere that I was screwing one of these 1x2s into another. Again, similar to my cabinet boxes, I'm using my right angle clamps for these as well. And I'm just lining them up, applying a bead of wood glue, and I'm using 1-inch pocket hole screws. These clamps worked out really nicely for both where I was joining things in the corner, but also where I was adding my vertical framing pieces that fell in the middle of a horizontal framing piece. The clamps had enough clearance for the horizontal piece to run all the way through, even in these middle framing pieces. I constructed 2 frames that were basically a mirror of each other, and I just used a regular clamp to hold this in place while I used the same pocket hole method to screw these 2 together right in the middle of where they'll sit on our cabinetry. With our face framing fully constructed, I could nail it in place on our cabinets. I used my clamps to roughly hold them in place as I worked my way from right to left using 1 1/4 inch 18 gauge brad nails. I made sure to use my level and adjust my clamps as I went to make sure everything was plumb and lined up with the cabinetry the way it was supposed to be. I always love when I get the face frames on because it just helps make them look so much more polished. It's not like a huge difference, but you don't see the raw edge of the plywood anymore. Before I move on to the doors, I wanted to talk about this little situation here. This is not the most correct way to do this. Like, it would have made sense to have like the seam over here, like this was one solid piece and then this butts up to it. But I wanted a continuous piece along both the bottom and the top just to help with it looking like one furniture piece. I will sand this and wood fill it and make it look a little bit more seamless, but I know that's not the most correct way to do it. They do make like 12 and 16 foot long pieces of this, so I could have had a continuous stretch, but that wouldn't fit in my car and I was not about to pay $80 to have it delivered. This type of wood, which I think I got poplar, is much better than what I used for face frames on the first cabinets that I built because the boards are just a little bit straighter. You don't have any like knots or anything anywhere that I'm gonna have to wood fill. I'll just have to wood fill the seams and the nail holes. They're smoother, they're gonna take paint or stain much easier. So they were just a little bit more expensive than like your basic level pine, but they make all the difference. But this size of board, the 1x2s, fit perfectly. They were exactly the same width of my 2 boxes fit together. For inset cabinets, which I did not account for when I did my first cabinets, you need your face frame to be flush with the side of your cabinet box for the hinge to work as it's intended. The face frame is level with the inside of the cabinet, which means that now we can go ahead and start working on our doors. For the rails and stiles of my cabinet doors, I use the exact same 1x2s that I used for the face frames. And since I'm making inset cabinet doors with 3 32nds of an inch gap between everything, I tried to be as precise as possible down to the 64th of an inch. I marked it out on my boards and trimmed them down with my miter saw. I am ready to route the mortise and tenon joints for my doors, same way I joined them the last time I did cabinetry, but I had some issues last time that I wanted to try and improve on this time, and that was especially when I'm writing a little protruding piece, I was ending up with like tear out along the edge, and then also like feeding it through and keeping it straight. I can't have my fence like super close together because of the type of bit that I'm using, which is a 1/4 inch rabbiting bit. So I had some issues with like not having a straight edge there. So what I just tried on a test piece that I found worked really well was running it through with a like sacrificial piece. So I'd run it through like this. That way, as I ran through, any tear out that happened on this piece here, my sacrificial piece. Whereas this, you can see, ended up nice and straight, and I didn't have any tear out on this guy. And then to make sure I didn't end up with like curved lines and just keep the line really straight, I took my little piece here that feeds through and I used a clamp to hold it all together to keep that straight as I fed it through, and that worked really well also. So I hope I can mitigate both of those problems as I do this. In order to get my tenons, which is the part that protrudes out of the rails, I had to run each piece through the router this way 4 times. My 1/4 inch rabbiting bit was set flush with the face of my table, so it was just a series of running, turning, and flipping these boards until I had all of my tenons on all 20 pieces. When it came to my mortise channels, I was a little nervous having my fingers this close to the router bit. So using some scrap wood that I nailed together, I created a little jig to help me run these pieces through. My piece fit perfectly in here, and then I could put, again, a sacrificial piece up against the edge and push it through, keeping my fingers well away from the blade. I had to do this again for all 20 rails, but also for all 20 stiles. For my longer stiles, which were about 30 inches, I set my little handmade jig in place next to the bit and then just used my hand to push it until the outside edge was flush with the edge of my jig, put my sacrificial piece in place, and finish running each of the pieces through. Again, I had to do this on 40 total pieces, so this definitely took me some time. Using this jig made this go so much faster, and also finding alternative ways to do things like this when you're scared of power tools helps make it a lot less scary and a lot safer. Now, I'm not a professional tradesperson or carpenter or anything, so this is not meant to be professional advice. This is just what made me feel the most comfortable as I was doing it as a DIYer. For the panels that sit on the inside of my rails and stiles, I had someone at Home Depot cut down as many pieces as they could from 1/4 inch plywood, so then I only had like 3 or 4 to do at home. To assemble my cabinet doors, I laid out all of my pieces, paying attention to which stiles were the right or left and which ones were the top or the bottom. And then in my mortise channel, I inserted these little rubber space balls that will help allow the center panel to expand and contract with humidity and temperature levels. I then applied a little bit of wood glue to my tenons and inserted them one at a time to my mortise joint on just the bottom, inserted my center panel, and then used a 3-foot clamp to clamp it into place. This held everything really well, while I then applied wood glue to my top piece, inserted that into both sides, and used a clamp to clamp that down as well. For any of the joints that were not flush, I just used a scrap piece of wood and hammered on that to push it down into place. And if I accidentally went too far, I could just put it along the bottom and bump it back up to the level it needed to be. Because I only have 4 3-foot clamps, I could only do 2 doors at a time. So I would do 2 doors and let them sit clamped for 3 hours until coming back and doing the next set. In total, this took me about a day and a half to do, taking me well into the evening on that second day. When I unclamped my last set of doors. The next morning, it was time to get to sanding. Some of the pieces along the face of my joints were not quite level, or along the outside may have had a little bit of a rough texture. So I first went in with 150 grit sandpaper, mainly focusing on those corners and those edges until they were all smooth, but then giving everything a good once over, even the center panel, to get off any rough texture. I then followed up the 150 grit sandpaper with 180 grit, and then I followed up the 180 grit with 220 grit sandpaper, again getting every surface, including the center panel, to really get it all smooth so that when we prime and paint it, we have a really nice smooth finish. While the 150 grit was more of a once over, I was very thorough with the 180 and 220 grit, both on the front and the backs of these. I repeated these steps again for all 10 doors. All right, my doors are done. I just unclamped the last one, and this is what they are looking like. There's nothing wrong with a basic shaker style door. I do quite like the look of that. However, for these particular cabinets, I wanted there to be just a little bit more detail. So I originally had planned on doing like single bead detail along the entire interior of this inset piece, and I could have used my router to do that. I have a bit that would do it, but it would have taken part of our width out, which then one made me a little worried about the structural integrity. It would have come in about 1/4 inch, and that's about how far our channel that we routed out on the inside of this was. So taking away part of the wood here made me a little bit nervous that the doors would fall apart or the panels would come out or something. Like as the wood expands and contracts with humidity and stuff, I didn't know if it would like just break that off. But also mainly, I did not want to lose any width here. I wanted to maintain the full 1.5 inches. So I went looking for pre-existing detail at Home Depot, and I came across this molding here. It's about 1/4 to 1/2 inch wide, so it's extending the width of our rails and stiles by a little bit, which is great because I wanted it a little bit thicker anyway. And then they had a couple of different options to choose from, and I really liked all of them. I did consider doing like the small egg and dart, or like they had a small dental molding, which I thought could look really interesting. However, I chose this one specifically because when I add baseboards, the cap along the top of it is a very similar profile to that right there. And also I'm thinking of adding like a chair rail and some picture molding in there as well. And the profile of the picture molding is again a very similar profile to this. There's a similar profile on some of the trim on my fireplace mantle, so I figured this tied into all of the other details in the space really well. It takes 2 of these pieces to cover the whole inside of it, and each piece was around $3. So per cabinet door, this is a $6 addition. I have 10 cabinet doors, so for this detail total, it is $60. And while I'm trying to be as budget conscious as possible, I want to show you what this does. So going from a basic shaker style door to just a little bit more detailed custom look. So although it did cost me $60 more to do these cabinet doors instead of just the basic shaker, to me it was worth it because even though these are temporary, it just makes it a little bit extra special and ties into some of those other details, making the whole design more cohesive. You can see here a side-by-side comparison where the 3 on the left have this added detail and the 3 on the right do not. To achieve this look, I just used some miter shears to trim these down to a 45-degree angle, and then I just kind of aligned it with the side where it was going, used a pencil to make a mark, and again trimmed with the miter shears, and then slid the piece into place. I did make them a little bit bigger just so they would fit a little snug and help minimize gaps in the corners. I repeated this same process for all 4 edges, and like I said, each door took 2 pieces to fully trim out. I then tried this tape trick with my nail holes where you lay down a piece of tape, nail straight through it and then apply your wood filler over top and then peel the tape off, and it's supposed to help minimize the amount of sanding that you have to do. Unfortunately, I found that taking the tape off took a lot of the wood filler out of the hole as well, so I ended up just applying it with my finger and then using the edge of my nail to get it out of the groove, and then along the more rounded part use the edge of my finger, kind of like sandpaper, to rub away all of the wood filler while it was still wet, except for what was in the actual nail hole. I used 5/8 inch nails for this, and I just had to make sure to send them in at a really steep angle so they didn't come through the other side. And I just repeated this process on all 10 doors. Once the wood filler was fully dry, I did come in with 220 grit sandpaper just to sand it down a little bit to make it nice and smooth. For the toe kick on my cabinets, I used 1/4 inch plywood as a kind of veneer, and I just trimmed it down to the height of my toe kick using my circular saw and my Kreg Accu-Cut Track. Now, I had to do a couple of different lengths of baseboards, so I repeated this step a second time to get another about 3.5 inch strip of 1/4 inch plywood. And then because I needed a couple of different lengths, I just trimmed them down using my miter saw. The piece to the right of our air return space was about 81 inches, while the piece on the left was closer to 35, leaving us with about a 31 inch piece to cover the space for our air vent. But before applying that piece and blocking our airflow, I had to create a vent cover out of this piece, so I just started by marking out a grid in pencil all the way along it. Okay, I have the piece of my toe kick here that is going to be covering like the little space that I left for the vent. And so I wanted to do something a little more decorative, but like still like let the air vent breathe. In my last video, I shared a picture of somebody who had done this in like their baseboard. So I'm kind of using that as like a reference / inspiration. Theirs had a lot more detail to it than what I think I'd like to go for. I think I'd like there to be a little bit fewer holes because they have a mix of larger and smaller. So I'm using my largest drill bit, and then I may do one other size and add a few smaller holes. But I'm just gonna start with like the base level, like grid pattern I have mapped out, and then assess it from there. Okay, I just tested a few out and I like the look of this. I did, however, just realize that I'm screwing through the wrong side of the wood. I'm screwing through the back into the front, which is causing some tear out along the front of this. So now the back has to become the front, which is okay. Because it's such a small piece of wood, there's not a huge difference. It's mainly in like the texture of it, and it's on the toe kick, so not a big deal. It's just this side of the wood isn't like the higher grade side. I've been really good up until this point about paying attention to that, and this just right over my head, so that's okay. I continued using the largest drill bit that I had all the way across this piece, and then went in with some sandpaper to smooth out the face of this, and then also rolled it up and sanded out the inside of the holes themselves. When I flip this over, you can see all of that tear out that I was talking about. So that definitely needs to be kept facing the back. And then once I put this in place, I really liked just the simplicity of this diamond pattern and didn't feel like I needed to add any extra smaller holes. Once this gets stained or painted darker, these holes will pretty much disappear and you'll barely see them, but I still think they're a fun detail. Another decorative detail that I'm adding to the toe kick is I'm gonna make these little like feet type things. I'll insert a picture of what I'm talking about. I've seen these become popular over the past like 2 to 3 years, and that's because they just help create a more custom and therefore high-end look, and also they're just cute. It's an extra detail and it helps make a piece of cabinetry look like a piece of furniture. Originally, I had looked at putting a piece of furniture along this wall instead of doing built-in cabinetry, since it is a temporary solution before we add our stairs in a couple years. But I couldn't find a piece of furniture that was big enough scale-wise that wasn't like way out of my budget. And also with me doing cabinetry the whole length, that really maximizes my storage, which functionally is what I needed out of these cabinets. I'm making these out of 3/4 inch plywood, and I think they're gonna seem a little chunky at first, but once I put them on the cabinets themselves, because there are so many and I'm only doing them on the 2 outside sides, I'm gonna try it out and then put them in place, and before I like glue them or nail them or anything, see if they make sense, because it is such a wide piece of cabinetry. Having just 2 legs in the corner might look strange. So we'll see, but I want to try it out to get that extra detail. Again, tying back to like the little bead detail inside the doors, the ogee edge of the countertop, and then also some of the picture molding and some of the molding on our fireplace. Just a nod back to that to make it look a little bit more cohesive and intentional. Now, I went through about 4 different iterations playing around with the shapes before landing on this one, but essentially I just started by using some scrap wood that was 1.5 inches wide to mark out a grid. I then measured 1 inch down from what would be the top and marked a horizontal line that intersected all of my vertical lines. I then marked 1/2 inch down from the top, as well as 1/2 inch over in our first column, and freehanded a little arch between the 2. I then finished the horizontal lines of the grid, working from the actual top of the piece and from our 1 inch line, and then made a mark in the very middle column, about 1/2 inch up from where our bottom would be. And I used a paint can to connect the bottom edge of our small arch to that 1/2 inch mark near the bottom, and finished out the stencil with just a little straight line to the bottom of the piece. I then came in with my jigsaw to cut it all out. I did have to come from a couple of different angles and use my drill to get my bit in to get all of my arches correct, but once it was all cut out, I came in with some sandpaper just to smooth down the edges, and then used a clamp to hold it while I took it to my miter saw and trimmed it down to the height that we needed. I then put it in place and used a piece of 1/2 inch plywood to replicate the thickness of what our baseboards are gonna be when we add those, just to get the full picture. Having completed our face frames, our cabinet doors, our toe kick and air vent detail, as well as these little faux feet on the outside edges of the cabinets, it was time to see how all of these pieces and little details came together to elevate this cabinetry. Now I've put all of this in place, but nothing is nailed in. There's no cabinet hinges on anything. I was hoping to get the doors on there, but unfortunately I put the hinges in my cart and then never actually ordered them. So they'll be here this weekend, and you'll get to see me mount those in next week's video. So if the gaps are a little off, that's why. They're not actually like officially in place, but that's gonna actually make it a little bit easier to paint and or stain these, which you will see in next week's video. Speaking of, you will also see me build the countertop in that video. It's taken me a little bit of time to figure out exactly how I wanted to do that, but I think I figured out the most cost-effective and simplest way for that to happen. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in that video, but next week the cabinetry will be done, because all that's left is the countertops and painting or staining and like nailing everything in. But on the topic of paint versus stain, I still think I would like either one. However, right now in this moment, now that this part is all done, I am leaning more towards painting, mainly because on some of the doors, the grain of the panel on the inside is not going the same direction. Stained, that might look a little weird, not might, that will look a little weird. I think I have like 3 or 4 that are up and down rather than side to side. And that's just because of the way that my wood got cut. To maximize my budget and not have to purchase multiple pieces of plywood, I got all of my doors out of one piece of plywood, but in order to do that, the grain had to be in different directions. So mainly because of that, I'm leaning towards painting, but also I think some of our decorative details, like our little feet and the inset on the cabinet door and our little holes that we drilled in the toe kick, I think those might get a little lost with stain. The stain, you're gonna see all the wood grain and everything, and I think those decorative details will get lost, whereas with paint, I think I'm gonna appreciate them more. So right now I'm leaning towards painting them. Initially, I thought I wanted to paint them the exact same color as my fireplace, but I think I actually wanna go like 1 to 2 shades lighter, still keeping them dark to contrast with the walls, but I don't know that I want those two the exact same color. So if I do paint, I do still have to pick the color. The 2 colors I'm kind of playing with are either Quiver Tan or Urban Jungle. So I'll insert a picture of each of those next to my mantle color, and you please give me your opinion on which one you think would work better, or if you have a better color idea, please send that my way too, because this is still very much up in the air. If you liked this video, I hope you will consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, I hope you will consider doing so and coming back next week when I do the countertop and paint and just finish up this cabinetry. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I'm wishing you all my best. Also, I'm thinking about doing Vlogmas and uploading 2 shorter, more casual vlogs every week in December. So if you like that idea and want to hang out throughout the holidays, please let me know your thoughts on that below.